Hello and welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. On this edition of the program, we have a look at how Russia is described and perceived in Western media. As the Ukraine crisis continues, so does the media campaign to paint Russia in the worst possible light. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Alexander Mercouris in London. He's a legal expert and an analyst. We also have Paul Craig Roberts. He's a former U.S. government official and commentator. On the phone, we have Ivor Crotty. He heads RT Television's social media unit. And here in Moscow with me is David Burghardt. He's a journalist from RIA Novosti. All right, gentlemen, let's talk about perceptions of Russia. Alexander, if I can go to you first in London, there seems to be the worse the situation gets in Ukraine, the worse Russia's reputation in the world is. And, it didn't start from a very high point.
No, it didn't. But if we're looking about the Ukraine situation, I think what we're seeing effectively is that the situation in the Ukraine is getting from bad to worse. Whatever policy the Western powers had in the Ukraine is going wrong. And what they do in this situation, and we're talking about the media here especially, is that they blame Russia for it, which is the default position whenever anything goes wrong in the world, especially in Europe. And we saw that in Syria, and now we're seeing it on a much bigger scale in the Ukraine, where, of course, Russia is involved. But having said that, and it's very important to say this, it's not Russia that is actually driving the situation in the Ukraine. It is the situation in the Ukraine itself, the disagreements that exist between the various parties there, but it is also, to a very great extent, Western policy. And Mr. Putin made the point that when Western policy goes wrong, they look also again for someone else to blame.
Paul Craig Roberts, I guess you would probably agree with that reading your commentary on many subjects, including Ukraine. But it's because Victoria Nuland's plan didn't work. So somebody has to be blamed for it, and it has to be Russia. There's no other person to blame. Of course, they won't blame themselves.
No, they won't blame themselves. But you see, it's not the fault of this is the government propaganda. The United States no longer has an independent media. In the last years of the Clinton administration, it was permitted for about 5 mega companies to concentrate the media. So what was once a fairly independent and dispersed media now belongs to 5 huge corporations. And the value of these corporations is their federal broadcast licenses. Without those licenses, these multi-billion-dollar companies would be worth nothing. And so they really cannot go against the government's position. So they no longer investigate or actually explain what's going on. They simply become a mouthpiece for the government's propaganda. And so this is the real reason for the coloration of Russia as the victim.
It's interesting. Collectively, I call it the echo chamber. Ivor, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the program is because you work with social media. And it seems to me that we're living in parallel universes, because I don't really take Western mainstream media seriously at all. I mean, it's fun every once in a while. And I was about to do it with a op-ed that was in the New York Times about Putin's useful idiots. It was written by a Polish writer. And I every once in a while take an article and just take it to shreds, line by line. But I'm just so tired of doing it. But social media is an alternative. I mean, people are learning more, questioning more, and actually producing raw material that others can reflect upon. And I think that's a very interesting experience, because we've never seen this before.
Sure, absolutely. Look, as someone working in the field, it creates as many challenges as it does opportunities. And everybody has got a voice. But I think if we're speaking about the Ukraine situation in general, I would absolutely echo Alexander and Paul's sentiments that there does seem to be a certain momentum and a spiral there in terms of the comment and the dynamics, the bipolarized narrative, let's say, around the Ukraine issue. Some of the most notable elements of the Ukraine story on social media have probably been the proliferation of content. So like the amount of videos that have been made and misconstrued and misrepresented, and also the amount of videos that have provided extraordinary footage and given people perhaps first-hand insight into what's been going on. It's been quite amazing, and the amount of footage is more than that was generated from Syria, let's say, over the last year. So, but there's also been this PR dimension. We can talk about Euromaidan PR, for example, and publishing organizations. I think they were out of Brooklyn that created a number of platforms that started lobbying influential people around Europe to back Maidan. This is back in December, before things really took a turn for the worse. But you've got to remember with social media, though, Pete, is that I think social media conversations tend to be polarized, and communities, interest group communities, tend to stick with their own and engage in very nasty, trolly battles if and when people come across each other.
David, you're sitting next to me here in Moscow. What you want to reflect on what we've heard so far?
Well, I have to agree with all of the guests that have already spoken. Also, in regards to Facebook and other social networks, I work in the business also. I'm apparently one of those mouthpieces of the Kremlin. But we're actually getting the news from the spot where it's actually occurring. And when people start posting things on Facebook and saying this is all the truth, this is what's going on, and I'll look at like the hyperlink and I see that what they're setting up there is like it ends in UA, which is a hyperlink for Ukraine, and I start piecing it together and reading it, and none of it is backed up anywhere with any sort of proof whatsoever. So it's this one-sided thing of we're right and everyone else is wrong, especially Russia.
Yeah.
Russia's attacking us, planes are flying over us, tanks are rolling in, and none of that has happened.
Alexander, if I can go back to you again, it seems to me I recently did a number of programs on the new Cold War, Containment 2.0. But let's face it, gentlemen, on this program, Russia is an easy target. And the number of people that have said to me over the last 20 years, it was so much easier during the Cold War. Everything was so simple. And, this is how the echo chamber, the media environment that Paul just described to us, this is how it's working, because it's very convenient, it's very simple. People don't want to spend money on investigative journalism, and no one really in Western mainstream media wants to really reflect upon the catastrophic strategic blunder the West has committed in Ukraine.
That's entirely right. But I would just make one point about the Cold War, and that is, and I know Dr. Craig Roberts will remember this, in the 1980s and during the Cold War, there was actually much more diversity in the media situation in the West. If you look at Ronald Reagan's Central American policy, for example, there were lots of people who criticized it. There were people who you could get alternative views in the media at that time. What has been happening over the last 10 years or longer is that the Western media situation has become much more monolithic and more monolithic about Russia at the same time as the international media environment is becoming more diverse. So we have social media appearing, which we talked about. We also have channels like Russia Today, Al Jazeera, all the others also appearing. And of course, that is also creating a more fluid situation, and it's a dynamic situation, and a very interesting one. And of course, the United States, as we saw last week with Mr. Kerry's extraordinary comments, doesn't like it.
Yeah, a couple of points on the social media idea as well. I think there is a general misconception around that, social media and the internet has brought about this extraordinary proliferation of viewpoints and standpoints that you wouldn't have got in the printed world. 2 points on that. One, if you look at the great new internet newsmakers, they're all American, by and large. And if you look at people like BuzzFeed, Mashable, Vice in particular, who after Simon Ostrowski's awful abduction and his experience there, of course, their ratings have absolutely gone through the roof. Not that they weren't doing badly anyway, but there's a homogeneity of opinion there. I think that it completely belies this idea that along comes the internet and suddenly everybody has a voice and everybody can find out exactly what they want. Secondly, we've also seen the rise of this forensic journalism and digital journalism, and there are firms like Storyful, which was bought by Murdoch for $25 million. A bunch of guys who were working in Dublin and got into verifying video content coming out of Syria, using all sorts of things like Google Earth and this, that, and the other. They basically sold themselves to Murdoch for $25 million, and now they're verifying videos all over the world from all sorts of scenarios. And they're making a big name for themselves in that as well, and they're seen as like a very influential voice. And you have these influential voices, people like Graham Moses, for example, the famous video verification guy who's been working on the gout attacks in Damascus. However, Hugh published a fantastic piece of work on social media and journalism and pointed out that in the Arabic-speaking world, it is common to make fun of the level of ignorance with which these so-called forensic journalists are practicing their trade and being interviewed all over on television, etc., for being kind of groundbreaking journalists. It's happening in an Anglophonic bubble. And that's not being reflected, and that like nobody's bringing that level of criticism, which is there to read in Pew, to the kind of reporting that we're seeing on the web. So my point is, I guess, that I just don't think the game is really changing as much as many people like to believe it is.
Paul, if I can go back to you, one of the things I find interesting in the media environment is that Western media just does not like to report about the nature of the regime in Kiev, the West's ally. There are plenty of individuals there have very unsavory backgrounds, and I'll say it, some of them are Nazis and neo-Nazis and ultranationalists. There's almost a complete whitewash in Western media about the nature of that regime, and it goes along the same lines of the people that the West are backing in Syria, people that are jihadists, Saudis that are sent there, and other from other countries in the region. They just never, Western media just doesn't want to talk about those stories.
Well, that's true. They can't. I mean, the American media, if some editor permitted that type of story, he would be fired. And the reporters and journalists have learned that they can't bring those kinds of stories because you cannot take a position different from that of the U.S. government. That's no longer possible in the American media because of the way the companies are controlled. They now function as a minister of propaganda. In fact, in the United States, we have a number of government agencies that actually hire many people to use social media. In fact, I'm almost certain that Victoria Nuland was using social media in organizing the initial protest in Kiev. So you can't expect American media, print or TV media, to take a position on any important issue different from the government. It's not happened for a long time.
I think we can all assume that, Paul, you're correct in what you just said there. But if I go to Alexandra, this becomes a national security threat because, I mean, Ukraine is at the very center of a potential conflict that is something that we haven't thought about for decades. And we're talking about two nuclear powers here. Russia is watching a country on its border dissolve, possibly into civil war. We're looking at extreme economic hardship. We're looking at a deep depression in Ukraine, and we have a potential refugee problem as well. And if what Paul says is true, and I agree with him, then we're going into the abyss.
We are indeed, because of course, if false things are said all the time, then those false things become very difficult to back off from, and they start informing policy. And what we are seeing is a steady drift towards confrontation in the Ukraine, within the Ukraine itself, between the various sides there, because there is no pressure from the United States and its allies on the people in Kiev to make concessions. We saw today that the acting president is now talking about setting up people's militias rather than entering negotiations. And at the same time, as the situation there deteriorates, the Russians have very important interests in the Ukraine, and one must never forget that or ignore that or disregard it. And of course, the potential for things to go badly wrong is very great. And what is driving it is a totally mistaken, or perhaps more correctly said, false understanding of what the situation there is, with no corrective from the sort of people who ought to be providing that corrective information, which is in fact the media.
May I add something to that?
Yeah, please do.
What we need to keep in mind is this whole problem comes out of the neoconservative ideology of U.S. world hegemony. And the reason for the coup in Ukraine was to bring strategic threat directly to Russia, to present Russia with all kinds of problems that would make the Russian government less able and less willing to get in the way of Washington's purposes in Syria and Iran or elsewhere. This is part of the hegemonic drive that is the main driving force in Washington to rule the world, either through complicity or puppet states. And so that's the real issue here. And if it presents Russia with civil war, demonization, all the rest, it distracts Russia and makes the Russian government less capable of interfering with these hegemonic drives. So we should keep that in mind. And the reason I think that it's easy to demonize Russia is that English is the world language, not Russian. And so the whole world's used to listening to broadcast in English. Of course, it's not Russia that, on false pretenses, destroyed Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, bombed Syria. Started the trouble in Syria, bombs Pakistan, Yemen. The real easy target is the United States, not Russia. And yet Russia, which has done literally nothing, is the one that's demonized. So I think that comes back to the English being the world language.
Ivor, if I can go to you,
I think there's a really interesting point. If you look at the use of if you look at how language is manipulated and spun into what the U.S. State Department calls public diplomacy, it becomes, like you said, Peter, it just becomes this echo chamber of nonsense and spin. But what's interesting now is that other, let's say, people like the Foreign Affairs Ministry in Moscow, most recently, I think they've copped onto it and they've got a bit smart.
Yes, indeed.
In how they've been dealing with it. They also started tweeting under the hashtag United for Ukraine, which was one of these cringe-inducing simplifications that was rolled out by the State Department on Twitter. But that also started, I think, with the Russian Foreign Ministry's smarts. I think were really exhibited by the photograph they took of Kerry and Lavrov kicking the football around the U.S. ambassador's residence in London when they went for a walk in the garden for a couple of hours to try and figure out a deal. And that created a very nice little domino of tweets between commentators. We even had a nice exchange with Miriam Elder on BuzzFeed over it, where we all hoped that the guys would come back with some kind of a resolution. But anyhow, the point is, yes, that language becomes more manipulable than ever, and situations that are complicated, like Ukraine, become more simplified. They become squeezed into 140 characters.
Yeah, that's my problem.
Therein is the danger of the medium.
Dave, if I can go to you, Ivor brings up something very interesting. I can remember covering for RT the attack on South Ossetia by Saakashvili's military back in August 2008. And I remember having in the studio with me live a deputy foreign minister who spoke English well, and he thought it was going to be a friendly chat. And my response was, well, why is Russia's PR so awful? It's really awful. I mean, Saakashvili has hundreds of foreigners working for them, being paid a lot of money, American taxpayer money, obviously, but they're doing a pretty good job because they're winning this media war, and Russia is on the right side. Speed up to today, echoing what Ivor had to say.
Yeah, it's switching now because, I mean, not necessarily that Russia is, I would say, investing in foreigners to work for the Russian media or not, but we are putting that news out in foreign languages. So we're getting more and more people, more and more readers who are actually reading us. One thing I'd like to jump off of that Ivor had mentioned is, for example, yesterday Turchinev, who's the acting president, made a statement that during Russia's exercises to the east of the country, planes had crossed over into Ukraine's airspace. 2 hours later, and that was reported all over the entire world, all in English and German and French, wherever you want it. As well as we reported that also, that he said that. And then 2 hours later, the acting defense minister actually denied that it even happened. So who are you going to believe, the president or the defense minister? Now, the defense minister's denial of that was nowhere in the West. It wasn't in their pocket. It didn't work in their direction. So we're not going to report it. We know nothing about that.
Alexander, one of the things I posted on Facebook yesterday, and I know you read it because you reacted to it, how much further can we go with this demonization of Russia in the media? Because, like I said, I don't really have much obviously, it's part of my job to be aware what other people are saying, but it's the same story written over and over and over again. It's a press release from Newland's people, and everybody just kind of adds a little value to it, if I can use that term. I mean, how much further can we go here with this discourse?
I think it's going to continue for a while yet. I mean, I think that at the moment, the way to explain the Ukraine crisis to Western audiences, that Western governments and the media that supports them is taking, is to reduce it to an existential struggle with Russia over the Ukraine, with Russia projected as the aggressor. And whatever happens in the Ukraine now is explained in that way. And awkward facts like the fact that there were no aeroplanes crossing over the border, that Ukrainian soldiers people with funny beards were not Russian soldiers after all that sort of thing. That isn't really part of the story, so it's not being talked about. And if I may come back to what Dr. Craig Roberts was saying, if there is an agenda here, by the United States to destabilise Russia through the Ukraine, or whatever it is, that is very dangerous, given that Russia is a nuclear power and has military forces there. Given that is so, it becomes more important in a democracy, and Western countries pride themselves on being democracies, for the media to report the situation factually. If they're not reporting that situation factually, then the danger that we see, that you were talking about before, becomes greatly compounded, because people are not being given the facts and they're not able to put pressure on their governments to restrain them as they should.
I don't think there's any possibility of the American media performing real journalistic functions. It's too carefully controlled.
Now, they would be offended if you told them that, though.
Oh, they're very offended when you tell them that.
I've told them that.
I'm
the
they know
stupid
that.
one.
They know that, and I've had it explained to me by journalists. They say, we can't possibly take the story to the editor. He'll say, do you want to get us both fired? So I think they do know that, or at least most of them. It's a job. Jobs are scarce.
It's a
today
job.
in the
Okay,
United States.
Ivor, I think you wanted to chime in there. Go ahead.
I just wanted to recall a little story that happened to me about how these bipolar narratives play out. I mean, it's basically the Star Wars narrative, isn't it? I mean, the way the situation is being presented right now in media. It happened such that I was involved with an anti-corruption organization in Ireland. When I lived and taught in Ukraine in 2003, I was really reminded of the dynamics of Northern Ireland by what I saw and learned in Ukraine during that year before the Orange Revolution. But I was later then involved in a political scandal which was vaguely related to Irish republicanism. There was an Irish Republican element in there. And I was asked by journalists that I knew, one of two questions. The first question was, are you a member of the IRA? And the second question was, why aren't you a member of the IRA? Yeah. And it's that kind of narrow-mindedness that is forcing, I think, or at least, providing oxygen to the kind of flames of unrest and paranoia and loathing that we're seeing on the ground in eastern Ukraine right now.
Paul Craig Roberts, one of the things that in looking at being played out in Ukraine, it seems to me obviously that Victoria Nuland's plan has failed, and it's utterly failed and very dangerously failed. Plan B possibly, and Washington's good at Plan B, is just to destroy the country because it doesn't want to leave any spoils for Russia. It's like a bully on a playground that if the bully can't have his way and the rules, then he will just throw out sand in everyone's face. In this case, we just have a failed state in Ukraine and make Russia pick up the tab.
I think actually Plan B is to use the crisis in Russia, the demonization of Russia, to increase the spending on NATO and the profits for Washington's military security complex. So Washington in the end will win by losing in Ukraine, because they will have now a new Cold War going against Russia, and will be able to keep the military security complex rolling in the billions of dollars of profits that it demands, and they will use this to beef up NATO positions in Eastern Europe, and this sort of stress and dangerous contention with Russia will continue. And that, I think, is the fallback. This is just the beginning of the new Cold War, and that is dangerous to humanity.
There was a Facebook post I saw the other day. This person was absolutely thrilled that NATO has moved their troops closer to Russia, and they've stacked up lots of them. And they shows this map of where they're all positioned. Yes, they've successfully surrounded Belarus.
Well, that's absolutely true. Alexander, if I go to you, I can remember that when we look at the frozen conflict, Transnistria, everyone was saying, well, is Russia going to invade there? And a friend of mine pointed out, I said, I guess you don't know geography very well because it doesn't border Russia. But this is what's happening here. For example, looking at the entire post-Cold War era, Russia has not been a threat to one single NATO country ever under any circumstances when it comes to a military dynamic here. And Poland is already in NATO. It already has, the other members have a commitment to its protection. I cannot see, and maybe I've just been living here too long, how in the world can Russia be a legitimate threat to Poland?
Well, it can't, is the short answer, and it isn't. I mean, the Russians have no desire to march into Poland, and anybody who thinks they do just doesn't understand the situation at all, or has been completely misinformed about it. As for Russia generally, I completely agree with you. And you heard what the recitation of the various wars that Dr. Craig Roberts made, which the United States has engaged in. Russia, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has been involved in two armed conflicts, one on its own territory in Chechnya, the second in South Ossetia, where its peacekeepers and its citizens were attacked. The problem with Russia is that it fights back when people pick fights with it. It doesn't actually pick fights itself, because its emphasis, as anybody who knows Russia can see, is the rebuilding of its society and economy. That is the overwhelming priority that Russians have, government and people.
And it doesn't get its friends together to go attack some other country. Well, we should grab China and go.
Well, I think Russia will be moving. It's a different topic, but it's an interesting one. I think one of the things that was said on this program, I think it's very interesting, is that Russia is a status quo power. It's not looking to extend its influence. It wants to rebuild at home. This has been Vladimir Putin's driving agenda. And the interesting thing is that we have a status quo power that is almost universally seen as an aggressor in the world. That's a pretty remarkable paradigm shift, I would say.
It's certainly put us on the back foot, Pete. I think if you look at Russia's position in the messaging around, let's say, global politics, I think the only place that Russia can look for a bit of positive PR and a decent bit of spin is probably from BRICS, and we might see a lot more of that in the future, given that there's ostracization taking place in pretty much every other major panel that Russia's involved in. But again, it's personally speaking, it's a great challenge to try and get a more objective and get a more positive message out there and try and challenge some of the spin that's going on.
Can I just say?
I was just, Alexander, I was going to say that's what my profession essentially is. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Alexander.
I think that's a little over pessimistic, because we are people who work in the Anglophone world, and because to some extent, we live in Russia and the West, we tend to see things very much in terms of Russia and the West. The world is bigger than Russia and the West. And I think if you go outside that particular sphere, if you look at other places, there is a great deal of understanding of Russia's position. And if we go back to the vote that happened in the General Assembly, half the countries in the world refused to support a US-sponsored resolution for the Ukraine's integrity, which is basically a criticism of Russia. And if you actually look at which countries refused to support it, they were the ones that accounted for something like 2/3 of the world's population. And I think that is an important thing to remember. The world cannot simply be reduced any longer to the United States and Russia and the West and Russia.
That's very
May
good
I say
point.
something?
Go ahead, please.
Keep in mind that the Brzezinski doctrine is that Russia is not to be permitted to renew itself and become a rival power. And that's why Washington has financed so many of these NGOs inside the Russian Federation. And Washington's actual strategy is to break up the Russian Federation itself. And it is very much part of American foreign policy to prevent the rise of other powers. And so the Ukraine is just one thrust of that.
Stone.
It's far from this enterprise from Washington is far from over. It's starting. So we're going to be faced with all
But it's
kinds
very
of
interesting
problems.
as we look at the last few years. We look at particularly Syria, and we look at Libya. There was just so much Russia could do, but this time it's a direct confrontation, and this is what I find very risky. And Russia is reacting very rationally, I think proportionally, irrespective of all the nonsense that we hear in the media. It's not going to be forced into taking action it doesn't want to. Paul Craig Roberts, I'm going to give you the last word on the program because I'm so happy you're with us today.
Oh, well, thank you. You mean you want me to spout on something? I think what we have to keep in mind is that the United States is a hegemonic power, and that's its motives. And Russia and China are its targets because they are rising powers that could threaten the status of the United States as the ultimate decider. And so we are going to be faced with considerable more difficulties unless, of course, something happens to American power. And that could be if the BRICS simply abandon the use of the dollar payment system, pressure on the dollar causes a collapse because the dollar as world currency is an important part of American power. And this power is dangerous because it has hegemonic purposes.
Thank you, gentlemen. I want to thank Alex, Paul, Ivor, and Dave here in Moscow at Voice of Russia Studio. Stay with VOR.